Snow fell like whispers across the wide Wyoming plain, each flake carrying its own hush, softening fences, swallowing trails, and burying every sound but the wind. The ranch sat alone at the edge of the valley, a black silhouette against the pale white, its barns and corrals half swallowed by the storm. Inside the main house, a lamp burned low, and in that amber glow Elias Crow sat with his back against the hearth, boots still dusted with ice, hands idle against his knees. He was a man admired for what he owned but pitied for what he lacked. The town called him fortunate, handsome, rich, but to Elias those words clattered like coins, bright but empty, never filling the silence of rooms too big for one man's breathing. Loneliness had grown familiar, a second skin he no longer fought against. Yet on nights like this, when the snow howled at the windows, he felt it press hardest like a hand at his chest, asking him to remember what he never had. Perhaps that was why he heard it, the sound that did not belong. At first faint, beneath the groaning timbers of the storm, a cry. Not the cry of coyotes that slink across the ridge, nor the moan of cattle shifting in the wind, but something smaller, rawer, carrying a tremor of need that slipped past his defenses. He stilled, tilting his head toward the dark, uncertain if the mind plays tricks when nights are long. But there it was again, thin as a reed, bleeding through the snow. Elias pulled on his coat, lantern swinging in his hand as he crossed the yard. Each step broke through crusted ice, the cold biting through leather and bone alike. The barn loomed, doors rattling under gusts, and for a moment he wondered if the storm itself had grown a voice. Yet when he pushed inside, the lantern light caught more than straw and shadows. She was there, collapsed against a mound of hay, her form wrapped in a blanket so worn it seemed more whole than cloth. Her hair spilled dark across her shoulders, damp with melted snow, and in her arms 2 infants pressed against her chest, their faces red with cold, their tiny cries no more than trembling breaths. He thought her asleep until her eyes snapped open, black, sharp, and mistrusting even through exhaustion. Elias froze. It was not fear that rooted him, but the startling clarity of her beauty, not polished or adorned, but carved out of struggle, every angle a story. She shifted, shielding the babies with her body, and he caught sight of her wound, a gash across her side, seeping through fabric dark against pale skin. "You can't stay out here," he said, voice low, carrying against the rafters. But her gaze narrowed, lips pressed tight, as if any kindness were a trap. He knew her kind, at least he knew what the town whispered. They called them outsiders, unfit to mingle, carrying blood they did not understand. She was Lakota, he realized, though he had never seen her before. That fact alone would rouse suspicion should anyone discover her beneath his roof. Already he felt the weight of what people might say, that Elias Crow, wealthy rancher, keeper of order, had lowered himself to shelter a woman who did not belong. Yet the sight of her wound, the fragility of the children, gnawed deeper than reputation. She could not last another night, not like this. And so he did not argue. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, ignoring the stiffness that ran through her body when his hand brushed near. He set the lantern aside, stirred the embers in the barn stove until warmth began to bloom, then fetched a pail of warm milk he had kept for calves. He placed it within reach, said nothing more. She hesitated, pride pulling at her expression, but when one of the infants whimpered, she reached with shaking fingers and lifted the cup. Her lips trembled against the rim, and she drank slow, as though she despised her own hunger. Elias watched, saying nothing, feeling the barn tighten with silence thicker than snow outside. He could sense her shame, how survival had become a humiliation forced upon her, and it pricked something in him, something long buried. When at last she spoke, her voice was a whisper ragged with grief. "We will leave at dawn." The words struck him harder than the storm. With 2 babes hardly able to draw breath, with a wound that made her sway even as she sat upright? Yet her eyes, though clouded with fatigue, carried a defiance unyielding as stone. She would rather die than beg. Elias did not reply, though his jaw tightened, though his heart urged him to protest. He only shifted closer, adjusting the straw so the twins lay upon a softer mound, then returned to the stove as if warmth alone could anchor them here longer. He could not ask her story, not yet, but pieces revealed themselves in the way she winced when shifting her side, in the way her gaze darted at every creak of the barn. A widow, he guessed. Alone by force, not by choice. Cast out perhaps, or fleeing some cruelty men like him had allowed to flourish. And now, with no one else in the world to claim her, she had stumbled into his barn, carrying 2 lives barely begun. The hours bled slowly. Elias kept the fire steady, fetched blankets from the house, though she accepted them with a stiffness that pained him. He tended to the horses just feet away, their snorts and shifting hooves filling silence where words might have gone. From time to time he caught her studying him, as though measuring what kind of man he was, whether his silence meant safety or danger. As dawn crept pale through the cracks in the walls, he found her standing near the barn doors, barefoot upon frozen earth, clutching the infants against her breast. She staggered under their weight, her wound reopened from the effort, yet her chin lifted stubbornly toward the white horizon. He felt shame stab through him, shame that he had thought first of townsfolk, of whispers and reputation, before thinking of how to keep her alive. Without speaking, he stepped out into the snow beside her. He removed his gloves, held out his bare hand, palm upward. His breath fogged between them, the silence taut. She stood unmoving, her pride a wall. Then, trembling, her hand slid into his. Her fingers were ice, so frail against his grip, and still she kept her gaze averted, as though accepting help stripped her of something she had fought to keep. He did not lead her back inside with force, only waited, steady as the earth beneath them, until her weight sagged slightly toward him. Only then did he guide her, step by patient step, back to warmth. That night, after tending her wound as best he could and ensuring the twins lay swaddled between blankets, Elias sat alone by the stove. He thought of the men in town, how quickly their voices could turn sharp, how suspicion could curdle into violence. Already he heard phantom hooves in the snow, neighbors arriving with questions he could not answer. He realized then that by letting her cross his threshold, even if only into his barn, he had chosen. Whatever storm awaited beyond these walls, he had tethered himself to it. And when her voice, softer now, reached him from the shadows, "Why risk so much for us?" He found no eloquent reply. Only truth, quiet as a confession. Because this place was empty until you filled it with life. The snow thickened outside, the world narrowing to the glow of fire, the slow breathing of infants, the unspoken bond between two strangers bound by necessity, fear, and something neither dared to name. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her brow, his hand lingering an instant too long. She did not flinch this time. Outside, the storm gathered its weight, erasing trails, sealing them in. Inside, something else took root, fragile, unsteady but alive. And though dawn would bring questions, judgment, perhaps even danger, for this night there was only the hush of falling snow, the fragile warmth of bodies huddled together, and the stirring of a story neither of them could yet imagine telling.